Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. Especially thank you, Lawrence, for joining. We will talk today about how to become an educational psychologist. One kind of area of psychology I'm very bullish about. I think it's a really kind of underappreciated sometimes area. Maybe that's not true, and a lot of people apply. We will learn in this talk. It's always a little bit weird to kind of introduce the guests or the speakers of these talks, because normally when you introduce somebody, you tell them about all their acolytes and what they do and who they are. But I think Lawrence will do a much better job during this talk, just to kind of, I don't know if it's housekeeping, just to kind of rules of engagement. I think most of you guys are familiar with how this works. Lawrence will give a talk about 30 to 40 minutes. And then we have like a 20-minute Q&A where you can ask like more specific questions that you have or to clarify. I already have one question that I want to ask at the beginning of the Q&A that one personal tutee asked me about, kind of her question about becoming an educational psychologist. If you have during the talk any questions where you're like, what is Lawrence talking about? I didn't quite get that. Just put them in the chat. You can either directly address them to me or to everyone. And if I think, oh, this is a really good moment, I would just rudely interrupt Lawrence and say, hey, I think here's a good question. Maybe you can answer that before we move on. And if not, I would just take note and give then or try to answer it myself. But I think it's better. Lawrence is the expert. I think I will try to kind of give him most of the questions. I hope that makes sense. We can't clap, but we're very happy that you're here. I don't know. Thank you so much for joining us. And yes, Lawrence, if that's okay, I would just unpin myself and would ask you to take it away.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Andreas, for the introduction and the setup. Much appreciated. So, hello, everyone. It's really nice to see you. And by see you, I suppose I mean see your names on the screen. We find ourselves continuing to have sessions remotely, but either way, I'm happy to be here to be speaking with you, and also look forward perhaps to having a bit more interaction later on when there's a chance for Q&A. But yeah, my name is Lawrence. I am an educational psychologist, and much like Andreas says, I've got some slides where I can speak to them today about my experiences of being an educational psychologist, my personal kind of path to becoming an educational psychologist, a bit about the role itself on the day-to-day, a few other factors that I thought might be useful. I tried to anticipate what kind of questions people might ask and structured the session around that. But of course, you may well have questions, and I'd be really interested and happy to talk about them with you. So yeah, I will get started. I will present the presentation. Just going to bring it up here. Okay, can you see the slides?
Yes, very well.
Fantastic. That's a good start, isn't it? Okay. So, like I said, I am Lawrence. I'm an educational psychologist, and this is my talk on how to become an educational psychologist. And I'll start by saying a bit about my own, I suppose, journey or my own experiences that led to me to becoming an educational psychologist. And I should say that, this was just one way, probably different from everyone else. In fact, certainly different from everyone else. And everyone will have their own experiences in order to throughout their journey on their career path. But I thought it might be helpful to say a bit about mine without going into too much self-indulgence. So I studied my undergraduate degree in psychology at the University of Kent. At that time, after I finished my undergraduate, I think it's fair to say I had absolutely no idea what I wanted to do with my life. And so I was just thinking about the next steps and doing a few different jobs along the way. Found a job as a dental insurance administrator. felt like that wasn't for me and wanted a big change. And so I was fortunate enough to be accepted to go teach English in South Korea. And after a few years of doing that, I got a bit of experience working as a teacher. And so I wanted to stay within the education profession and got some work as a tutor. And then thinking about, again, the kind of returning to that question that I asked myself after my undergraduate, what next, and what of my career, what of my life? I started to think a bit more. And actually, I was looking on LinkedIn and came across a role as an assistant psychologist. And I thought, this brings together my experience of being a teacher, an English teacher in Korea and a tutor, and also my interest in psychology from my studies. So for me, it seemed like quite a good pairing. So I got a job as an assistant psychologist through LinkedIn a few years ago. And I did that role for a year. That gave me a bit of insight into the role of an educational psychologist. And so I applied for the doctorate, got accepted. And over that period of time, a few years ago, I was studying on the doctorate. And for the last few years, I've been an educational psychologist up the road from you guys, just up the road in near Highbury and Islington Station, in Islington Educational Psychology Service, where I am currently. So that was my kind of journey, my experiences to get to the role where I am today. But like I say, everyone I know who I'm working with, everyone I know who's an educational psychologist has had different experiences. I know that some people can get jobs as an assistant psychologist and that can help, but I know that the training courses are interested in people having lots of varied experiences. I don't think that there is a particular emphasis or value on having an assistant psychologist, or certainly no requirement to have an assistant psychologist post before becoming before being accepted for the training. That can help to give you personally an insight and give them, the course directors who select people at interview, some sense about whether that role will be right for you and therefore right for the profession. But it's certainly not a requirement. You wouldn't want a course that only has people who were assistant psychologists beforehand, because then there'd be less variety of experience. But I'll say a bit more about that later on. So in terms of the day-to-day, what does an educational psychologist actually do? And that can be quite a philosophical question, and one that I think can be helpful to ask myself. What do I actually do from time to time? But I would say that generally, all of these boxes capture the bulk of the work of the day-to-day, of the week-to-week, of what an educational psychologist does. The top left box there, consultation, I would say is a key part, because fundamentally we are working with schools, working with families and young people to support young people with learning, and using psychology, applying psychology to offer a unique contribution to understanding and supporting young people, perhaps when there are more difficulties around their learning. And so if there is some concerns, then the consultation is what we call the process of talking through what concerns us about a young person, what support is in place, what's going well for them, what are some areas of need, what support looks like, what further support could look like, essentially exploring a sense of what's going on here. And that's a chance to think about applying psychology in those conversations, thinking about applying things like attachment theory, thinking about attachments that young people have and how that has a relationship to their learning. If you don't feel secure in your attachments or haven't in the past, then perhaps there's a preoccupation around feeling safe in the classroom in order to learn. Similarly, something like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If in children's personal lives, if they're not having breakfast before school or are not eating much, then your basic needs around food and hunger can affect your concentration. Or if the family is currently going through a house move, that could also have an impact. So thinking about the Maslow's hierarchy of needs is another way that we could be discussing, thinking about how those could have an effect on a young person's learning. Of course, we might not necessarily be so explicit and share those theories with parents, or maybe we would. I think we have to get a sense of what comes out from the consultation. Essentially, when there is some concerns, or when a referral is made to us, consultation is often how we explore what is concerning and what support could look like and what our role could be. But then around that, we might also agree that it's helpful to do some assessment work with young people directly to do assessments around skills for learning, or perhaps their views, young person's views about what their school experience is like. We might do some observation in the classroom, in the playground. We might do observation depending on what kind of work comes our way, observations just of the school, like a learning walk. We might do some training if we feel like the schools we work with are asking for some particular area of need and support. We could offer training. I've done some training around recently around growth mindsets, and around kind of Carol Dweck, her work around that, really. So around kind of intelligence and alternate forms of understanding intelligence. Done some training around supporting children's well-being at school. Lots of different things, really. We also, in the day-to-day, we might do some direct intervention work with young people, thinking about therapeutic or educational support directly. We might do some whole school project work with schools. That could be things like, what could it be? Well, for example, sometimes the way that systems are functioning can have an effect on lots of young people. If a school is, say, needing a bit of support with thinking about how they organize themselves or how they communicate with each other about the systems that are in place, say for giving support around children's mental health at school, for example, then we might say, let's not just work with one young person. Let's think about how you're supporting everyone with this and think about it as a project. And no job would be complete without a little bit of emailing, admin, report writing, and team meetings. So I think whatever job well, maybe that's not true. I was going to say whatever job you have, it would have a bit of that. But certainly there is a little bit of that with our role.
Lawrence, could I ask you one question? Because I think it kind of fits here. I mean, in some ways, sometimes the reputation of an educational psychologist would be that it's a lot of assessment. I think if I kind of like, before I met you, like people like online, if you look on YouTube or so, people describe an educational psychologist like, oh, it's not just testing. But then you kind of go away and it's like, I don't know. So how much, if you kind of look at this board, obviously this depends on like the council you work in and blah, blah, but how much do you do assessments? And of like, I don't know, learning difficulties, learning, etc. And how much else could you, like, if you could have like a rough estimate or something, I don't know. It would be lovely if you could address that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say that, yeah, there's the interesting thing about reputations is that perhaps sometimes there is some truth to it, but also it's not quite exactly that way. So yeah, we will do some assessments, but I think also historically the profession has sort of been built on, well, essentially when the role was first created about 100 years ago, it was built around intelligence testing. So that has kind of been the foundation, but there's been a lot of articles and a lot of kind of thinking in the profession over time, kind of evaluating the role and how it can be most impactful. And especially now that the training is 3 years, I think there is a lot more capacity to share different ways of working, and not just doing lots of individual assessments with young people. But it is still part of the day-to-day of what schools are hoping for when they're kind of making referrals to our service. And also, as well as their hopes, my view is that in certain circumstances, it is helpful to do assessments of and with young people. So I would say it really varies.
Mm.
I
I
would say
think
it very.
Anna has a little bit like a related question. Is like how much mental health. Like if I kind of like I love working with children, but maybe I'm interested in learning difficulties, but then I also want to do like things that are more related to mental health. Like, is
Mhm.
that how much is that a part of that kind of like assessments or like mental health? I think if that's Anna has several questions. I noted them for later, but I think that's part of the question. I think if I understand correctly.
Excellent. And yeah, really good question, Anna. I would say that one of the things I really value about this role is that there is a lot of flexibility and a lot of opportunity to sort of develop your practice as an individual in the way that you feel you're going to be most helpful to schools and to overall to society. And definitely lots of EPs have individual interests. So I think thinking about supporting children's mental health and mental health in schools for staff as well has been a huge theme in our profession and in schools over in all society really over recent years in particular, and especially in relation to the pandemic. So a lot of the things that schools are discussing with me, the referrals that they're making to our service, there's, if not entirely, there is definitely an aspect around supporting mental health and well-being, and then thinking about how that has a relationship to learning in the classroom as well.
Mm.
There are some specialist posts, some specialist roles that can be relating to just mental health and well-being. There is also project work that relates to supporting mental health and well-being. For example, in Islington at the moment, there is an initiative to support schools to develop a culture, a school culture around supporting trauma-informed practice. So drawing from the knowledge that we have of trauma, the impact of kind of developmental trauma on the brain, thinking about effective responses, that helps to support emotional regulation that's informed by evidence-based approaches. These are some things that EPs can specialize in and do more of in their practice. So if you have an interest in that area, it could definitely be cultivated. And that could be if you work in a local authority employed like I am, if you work with the kind of commissioners, with the senior managers to communicate your interests, but also there is opportunities to work privately, and you could offer more of that work directly. But often there is a lot of scope for this kind of work when you work for the local authority, I would say, definitely, in fact.
All right, fantastic. I think it would be good if you move on.
Yeah, sure.
But yes, I think it's kind of to get a feel for. I think it's good to know how much like one of the others like part of it. But that was very helpful. Thank you so much.
Definitely. I would just say very briefly that supporting mental health could be quite a small piece of involvement, just having one consultation with a parent and teacher, and you to feel like things have moved on from there. Or it could be like a whole school project. It could be a more detailed piece of work with a young person if there's a little bit more to unpick and explore there. So again, you've got a lot of autonomy in order to explore and support in the way that you feel is going to be most impactful, and agree that with parents, young person, the whole school themselves. So yeah. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so do EdPsychs only work with young people? Maybe I've already spoken a little bit about this, but yeah, I would say actually often our work involves working less directly with young people. And that's because there can be quite a high demand for our service. And so we find that the most effective way of supporting young people is to support the people who support young people. So we might have a consultation with parents and a teacher just to kind of explore things, and perhaps we feel like that's a way of moving on. Sometimes we might feel like there's a bit of a question about what's the young person's experience of school? How do they feel about their school? How do they feel about themselves as a learner? How do they, how does their mental health affect their capacity for learning? Then we might meet with them more directly. But if we feel like already we've got a plan moving forward, we may decide that actually just work with the adults is going to be the most impactful thing at the moment. Also, we're currently running a project with teaching assistants in Islington, which is another kind of project supporting mental health. There's a role called Emotional Literacy Support Assistant, which is essentially a specialist teaching assistant in supporting mental health at schools. So our service is giving training for those to develop them into those roles. So we might work with teaching assistants in that way. I met with a head teacher a couple of weeks ago and commissioned a project around supporting the systems around support for children with special educational needs. That school, they felt like they need a bit of extra support around the bigger picture of their support. So I find that because head teachers have the most amount of power at the school, they are good people to liaise with, to work with, to commission work. So yeah, often we'll work with lots of different people, not just directly with young people. You can decide the best way to work, who to work with. As I say, you've kind of got a bit of that flexibility based on the situation as you deem it. Okay, so at this point, no doubt you're thinking, sounds good, sign me up. But I would say, well, I guess I'm kind of reflecting on my own experiences. When I was an undergraduate, I really felt like I wanted to know what, a bit of anxiety, I suppose it was. I wanted to know, what am I going to do after uni? What's that look like? You know, what's the next step? The not knowing can sometimes be anxiety inducing and uncomfortable. And it's quite easy for me to give advice because I have a job now. But I guess I would say, if I was to give advice, I'd say develop curiosity. That's the key way of knowing whether this kind of work is for you. So, you know, learn from experience, develop curiosity, move towards roles and things that interest you, and then that will give you more evidence over time as to whether this kind of work is for you. Perhaps a role in working in a school or working in the community. If that seems interesting to you, then naturally you will develop the skills and knowledge to be able to talk about those experiences at an interview. But if you want to apply, then usually you need a 2-1 or a first degree, or have done a kind of a conversion course if people have studied a different undergraduate degree. Also, what have I got here? Oh yeah, masters. Also, you could do, you know, a master's can be seen to be helpful, but certainly not required in order to apply for the doctorate course. Your course needs to be make you eligible for the BPS. It's called BPS Graduate Basis for Chartered Membership. I think the City University course should have that. Andreas, do you know?
We do.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Most courses do, so that should be fine. And you also need a minimum of 1 year's full-time experience of working with young people or working in school or community settings. You don't need to be a teacher. Previously, you did have to have a teaching qualification. You do not need a teaching qualification. I don't have a teaching qualification, but I do have some experience working in the classroom. So that is what's required. But to speak to your question from your tutee, Andreas, they asked about if you have a 2-2 and whether that would be what would make you eligible to apply.
Yes.
In my experience, it would. So if you have a 2-2, I think that's okay. But perhaps, you know, I guess it. I'm friends with one of the course directors at one of the universities, and he said to me that for him the most important thing is about suitability of that person, of their experiences, of their ability to reflect on their experiences, their knowledge of psychology. And if someone has a 2-2 but they feel like they have the skills to be a good psychologist, that's the most important thing. You know, I'm sure that some people with a first degree may not feel themselves that actually that they have the right skills or want to do the role of a psychologist. If they started to get some experience and consider it, they might reconsider later, actually, this isn't for me. Equally, someone with a 2-2 may feel like this is exactly what I would like to do, and I feel like I've got the skills for it. And so most courses should consider someone with a 2-2, so long as there is sufficient evidence that you would be the right kind of person for the role and therefore to kind of support the profession. But I suppose probably if you had a 2-2, there may be more questions at maybe not at interview, but at the kind of at the selection stage about that. There might be further question like, okay, they have a 2-2, do they have the kind of academic skills that are required for this role? That may be the question in their mind, but wouldn't hopefully discourage them from potentially inviting you to an interview. I hope that answers the question for your tutor as well.
Yes, yeah. That's very good. I think I was kind of, I mean, there's a little bit like, maybe this is a good point to kind of ask another question that I often get.
Great.
Is because like a lot of students come to me and it's like, oh, what should I do? I want to become X. And then now I want to do a master's. Like, why do you want to do a master's? And I basically, for educational, counseling, clinical, all of these routes, it's just like, please don't do a master's. Because what you need is really work experience and just the undergrad. But then there's sometimes but can I make up for my 2-2 with like a better master's degree? And I think the answers I get are a little bit mixed in terms of like when I talk, she's like, yeah, maybe not. I mean, it would be a way to kind of address yours. Like, if I wonder, am I be capable of doing like the dissertation project that's part of like becoming an educational psychologist, which you probably talk a little bit in a second about, like. And then if I did it in a master's, then I might feel better about that. So there might be a way to do that. But I don't know, like in general, because you said it might be good, but it's definitely not needed. I often say like, don't do it because you need work experience more than anything. So what's your take on like I don't know. Is there like, I don't know. I'm running out. Yeah.
I would say if I was the person who was interviewing someone or looking through the applications, whether someone has a master's degree or not wouldn't be the thing that would be the kind of deciding factor for whether I felt like it was good to interview them. It would be the experience that they've got would be more valuable, and I think that speaks to the role that this is. It is you're applying psychology in school and community context, so you're working with people directly. You need some knowledge of the psychological theory, but you also need some knowledge of working with people, experience of working with people. So, I've always kind of said before that if you're thinking about whether a master's degree would give you the give you kind of the edge or the credentials to do the role, you could treat your experience as like the master's degree in order to apply, because it's not required. Like it might, I know some PhD courses do require undergraduate masters in order to get to a PhD, but the masters would be your experience, because that's what they're looking for when you're being interviewed, your ability to reflect on your experiences that you've had. And so if your experiences have been purely academic, then you may not have much ability to reflect on your experiences of working with people. So I would definitely say that if you feel that doing a master's is going to be the thing that will get you to become an educational psychologist, I would say that's probably not true or likely. But if you have an interest in it and you get a role working in a school and are able to then think about how psychology applies in those contexts, that's the kind of thing they're going to want to hear about at an interview. And also would give you experience yourself about, do I want to work in this setting?
Yes. I think for me, and also, I mean, if you haven't volunteered or worked with children, but then you say, I really love working with children, you're just like, but how do you know if you never do it, right? But I think, I don't know, do you talk at a later section a little bit about getting work experience? Because then I would postpone my questions around that topic that I got from the students. If not, we could just use this now and talk a little bit about what is good work experience? What is that 1 year besides like a system psychologist? I think what would be good places? I think one question came up is like, working in schools, primary, secondary, is that a good place? And I said, yes, that is a very good place to, right? I think being a teaching assistant for a year or two is really good. But I don't know if you're later talk about this now. I don't know.
Yep,
Whatever you want, it's your talk, right?
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's talk about it now. I would say that the experiences that people have had before they've come to start on the course have been teaching assistant, definitely, teacher, different roles within a school, such as a Senko as well, coordinator for special needs at a school.
Mm.
I would say that assistant psychologist, a lot of people have had that experience. A lot of people have worked in community mental health settings, perhaps with CAMS, the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service is from the NHS. Other people working in other community settings, even like, working in care homes, working as volunteers in schools, even kind of doing school placements as part of a placement year at university.
Mm.
I did tutoring and worked abroad as a teacher, as like an English foreign language teacher. So anything really that gives you that experience of working with people in educational settings in the community is what they're looking for. I think maybe I do say more specifically what the requirements are, but each of the websites for the courses will also have information about that specifically. But that's kind of generally what kind of roles people have had.
All right, that's very helpful.
Excellent. Okay. So yeah, in terms of applying, if you're thinking about applying for the doctorate itself, it's I don't know if I've even said yet, but it's kind of a 3-year course. Oh no, I will say, I'm going to say that a bit more about that next, actually. So if you are interested in finding out more about applying, then this is the website you can find out more about, the Association for Educational Psychologists website. If you can look on the website for free, but if you then want to make an application, then you have to pay a small admin fee. There are 13 universities that offer the course, 4 in London, and around 203 places. That might have changed in the last year, but there's around 200 places that there's been agreed funding for more. So there will be around 300 or 250 in the near future that you can, where you can be accepted. You can also pay to fund a placement privately, but that is quite expensive. So not everyone has that option available. And I'm guessing you're probably looking at that thinking, oh, that's not many places. And I would agree, it's not that many. There are going to be more, but generally they have about 1,000 applicants per year, maybe slightly more. So that means that about 1 in 5 people who apply will be accepted. And again, 1 in 5 isn't too bad. It's not, it's not the easiest of ratios, but equally, yeah, 1 in 5 is not so bad for a job, I would say. Yeah, so maybe it's not as bad as you might think. What else would I say to that? No, I'll say a bit more in the next one, which is, if you are accepted onto the course, this is vaguely what happens. I studied at the University of East London on the doctorate, and it looked a bit like this, where we had 6 taught modules. We have some placement days where you spend time in a psychology service and they kind of show you the ropes and give you opportunities to observe. You've got some private study days, you do some assignments. And then initially you're spending a bit of time just sort of shadowing, and then you start to do some work with schools with a bit of support in your second term. And then you do a bit more time and more direct work in your third term. And then in year 2 and year 3 of the doctorate, there's a bit more of a focus on research, but also on placement as well. So in the first year, you're being taught a lot more of information about psychology and how it applies to school and educational contexts. But then, yeah, the emphasis shifts more to you a little bit, your experience on placement and your research. You have to do a research project. So normally you're working 3 days a week on placement, have about 1 day a week as a taught module, and then a bit of time to do assignments and research as well. And then in year 3, you have to submit a research thesis. So you're balancing doing a thesis and doing work on placement with a bit of university lectures thrown in for good measure as well. So it is, 3 years can be quite a big commitment, and doing a research thesis, it can be quite a lot of work. So I did find personally, as someone who is not as organized as some of my course mates, that I was working a bit on the weekend. But I know people who have been able to do that without working at the weekend. So it's kind of down to you. But you do have a lot of flexibility when you're with your time. You can work more placement days, fewer placement days. You can, work more when suits you. And I really liked working on the doctorate. In fact, I absolutely loved it. Having lots of time to think with colleagues about kind of really interesting stuff, talking about the experiences on placement with colleagues, with other students, having the privilege of spending so much time focusing on one topic in a lot of depth to kind of explore that, is a real privilege. And, you're essentially being paid by the government to get a job and do some interesting research. So that's it's pretty cool, I thought.
Yeah, I think it's important to highlight. I don't know if that's like you said, it was like you get paid to do this, and pretty well. Right, just like I think it's not just like, oh my gosh, this is like, no, it's like you do this and you work 3 days and you're one at a university and you get paid to do this. I think it's a pretty awesome. Yes, sign me up. Yes, to quote your earlier, just to kind of highlight that. I don't know, like, do you have a slide on earnings, or like, I don't know.
Yeah, it's on the next one.
Okay. All right. So it's like just setting you up. Sorry.
No, absolutely. No, it's good. It's important. So yeah. Oh, is it on the next one? There it is. I'll come back to this one, the one I've skipped. But yeah, I'm sure your eyes are darting to the numbers there. But yeah, for your funding, if you're in London, you get about £16,000 tax-free, which is equivalent to about a £22,000 salary job. So you get given that for 3 years whilst you're training. And then when you qualify, the starting salary is about 38k. You can go up to about 60k and more for senior roles. So, this is information that's kind of freely available online, but I thought it might be helpful just to share that that's what it is. And I think that is above the UK average and above the London average. So, it's not bad. You are a specialist by that point. You've spent 3 years training, so you can offer something which not everyone else is able to. So hence the above average salary, I suppose.
Yeah, median income I think in London is 26,000 per year. So I think it's quite substantially higher. I think like in other parts of England, obviously in the UK it's less, right? But it's like so yeah, it's quite substantially higher than like the average person, whoever that is.
Yeah. And yeah, I wanted to say, like, it is competitive, but you are as good as anyone else. I think I definitely thought when I was applying, like, oh, it's so competitive, I don't know if I want to do it. But they have to select some people, and so why not you? I mean, they selected me. So why not you? If you want to do it, I would say don't let anxieties that you're not good enough be the reason that you don't apply, because even if you don't get accepted the first time when you apply, that's an opportunity for learning, if you want to see it that way, to find out more about the role, get more experience, learn more, and then come back and try again if that's something that you would like to do. I should say as well, yeah, it's a job that's in limited supply and high demand. So every week I get an email from the AEP with new jobs that are being posted. They're being posted around the country all the time and around London all the time. So there is a lot of good opportunities to get a job. I think everyone I trained with got a job whilst they were training. So at the moment, the way things are, you're in a pretty good position for jobs, to be able to get a job, which is a nice thing, really. It's not, we can't say that for all jobs at the moment. There are going to be more people that are being trained, and that could change, but at the moment that's how things are, and historically that's how things have been. So that's a kind of a good indicator, really. If you want to be an EP, though, that applying for the doctorate is the only way, either applying or self-funding. To use the protected title of educational psychologist, you have to go through that training process. But there's no age limit. I think the youngest person on our cohort of trainees was 25, who'd qualified, who'd finished their undergrad at 21, had a couple of years working in a school as a teaching assistant, and then applied for the doctorate and was accepted. And then the older person, I know someone who's been in their 60s and has applied and has qualified. So, it's more about the kind of the skills that you can offer and what you can bring to the profession, really. I would say, if you're interested, look up, there's a lot of information on the individual universities' websites. There's a lot of stuff on Facebook. There's a lot of, there can be a lot of anxiety posting as well that people can put on there. So be cautious in getting information from Facebook groups, but it can be useful information too. Speak to me as well on LinkedIn. We can have a chat. If you want to find out more, just let me know. I'm happy to speak to anyone, anytime. Some students from the talk last year reached out and we spoke a little bit more, and they wanted a bit of help with an application or with asking a few questions. So, please do that. I will just go back quickly to the last slide, and I also want to be aware of time, make sure we've got enough time for questions as well. I can see there's some I can see the red dot on the chat circle. I haven't seen what's been asked yet, but I can see there are questions there. So
I have all the questions noted down. I have all the questions noted down. Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay. This is a bit about work experience, actually. Maybe we should have make sure to cover that. So I would say, in terms of how to get relevant work experience, I think I mentioned a bit about this already, but I'll just scan through. If you want to, I suppose a question to ask yourself is, do you want a career in the helping professions? Do you want to do a role where you're working directly with people, sometimes who have some difficult life experiences and are stressed? Do you want a role which therefore can be challenging, but you hope to be helpful, to make a difference to people's lives? Is that the kind of thing that you want to do? It's a nice thing to be able to do, but also it can be challenging. And I would say during the pandemic especially, it has been challenging. There's been a high amount of increase of workload. I think I would say my job does keep me busy. There are some times when I enjoy it more, and sometimes I do find it difficult. So but it's also a privilege. People are very honest and open with you. They talk about their difficulties. They want your help. So to be able to be in a position of helping is a privilege, despite the challenges that it can bring. So I guess for yourself, what are your values and what's important for you? Is that something that you would value in a job? Is that an important value for you in terms of your future career? I've kind of mentioned before, apply for jobs which interest you. It's okay not to have your dream job after graduation. Give yourself permission to follow what interests you, not what you feel you should do or what you feel others think you should do. It's okay also not to know what you want to do. What is your dream job? I think the idea of the dream job can sometimes be a myth. So, move towards things that interest you and inspire you, and that will give you evidence as to whether that's something you want to do more of, really. And again, in your work experience, it's about applying psychology. It's less important what you do, but what you can learn from it. And everyone is eligible to apply, no matter their background, because psychologists work with people, all people. So, don't think that because of the person you are or any experiences that you haven't had that you're not eligible to do that role. Psychologists work with everyone. Okay, so a few final thoughts and then we'll come to some questions. I remember when I went to my university's psychology society meeting, and they were talking about becoming different like roles that you could become as a psychologist: educational, clinical, counseling, all these different roles, and talking through, how competitive they were. Essentially a talk a bit like this, but about all psychology careers. And I remember thinking, there is no chance that I'm going to become a psychologist because it's too competitive, and everyone else in this room seems to be much more keen to become a psychologist than me. They want to, they're kind of here at the meeting, they're writing notes a lot faster than me. It's not for me for that reason, was kind of what I thought. But actually, over time, I felt like maybe it is something that interests me, because I wasn't thinking about it in terms of other people. I was thinking about it for myself, really. So I learned from my experiences of work and thought about the kind of work I wanted to do in the future. And that came a few years later, but still, I thought it was interesting to note that I did at one point have that thought, there is no chance that it's for me or I'm going to do it, because of my perception about how competitive it was, when actually, when you look at the data, it is about 1 in 5, or maybe between 1 in 5 and 1 in 10, which, isn't so bad and not as competitive perhaps as has been shared before sometimes. I've spoken a bit about graduating from undergraduate and now what. Again, I would kind of reiterate, just do what interests you, do what makes you feel curious, and that will probably, even if not an educational psychologist, that will probably lead you to, a happy, more fulfilling career and life if you move towards what you find interesting and curious. And if that just so happens to be educational psychology, then fantastic. And if it doesn't, fantastic. I would also say that imposter syndrome has definitely been a theme throughout the training when I was training to be a psychologist, and that was true of everyone on my cohort as well. I think I still experience that on a week-to-week basis into different levels. So yeah, I think that, but then I think that's okay as well. I wouldn't claim to know and have all of the answers, because some situations are quite tricky and new. But sitting with that discomfort, I think is okay. So that's just a kind of personal reflection, really, to say that even if I might be Dr. Lauren Berridge, I'm also just trying to think about the best way to be supportive in my role as a psychologist as well. And sometimes I reflect back and think perhaps it would have been better if I did X, Y, or Z. And that's okay, because that's just part of any job, I think, or any experience in life. You learn and try to do it better next time. Okay, that's me.
All right, fantastic. I think it would be great if you just, then we see you back big, if you stop sharing your screen. I think it's at least I like it better, I don't know.
Stop share.
And then this was really, really good. I think it's kind of funny. Yesterday, I was part of a panel talk about how to make it in academia. And many of the things you just said is like the same thing, where it's like, I don't know, I've never really had a big plan. I just followed my intuitions, and that's more interesting. I want to do that. And then I ended up, and a lot of other people are like, oh, and then I strategically did this and that. I was like, I don't know. That was never me. There are different types to get there. And I think, I have, like, I would just go through the kind of like the question that I saw. I think maybe you can start, Nadia, just ask a question about like challenges you face working within this profession. I think you're in Islington, so I can imagine there's like a wide variety of kind of even like sometimes very kind of, I don't know, personally touching. If you work with trauma, like what are maybe like what are the challenges? And then I would just go through all the questions that I have written down during the talk,
Sure.
and yeah, they're not quite ordered, but maybe you can start there, and then I would just like, if anyone has any other questions, just please put them in the chat. And I'm sorry, my dog is destroying the bedroom in
Oh,
the
no.
background. You can see he moved the mattress already a little bit. He's just like, yeah, he's a
Dogs
bit.
do what dogs do.
Yes. All right. Challenges.
Challenges. Hmm. So the question was,
What
what do you
kind of
find particularly
challenges are you
challenges?
facing, like while working? So not so much getting there, but when you work, like what do you think is challenging? I think Nadia, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's how I understood the question.
Great. Yeah. Well, I would say challenge in different ways. I think usually when a school is making a referral to a psychologist, it's usually because things have gotten pretty difficult. You know, they're feeling like they're not sure why a young person isn't learning. They're not sure why they're behaving in a certain way. They're feeling a bit stuck. So, you know, the profession is sort of built around supporting challenging situations, but
Mm,
also, you know, a challenge is also an opportunity, and therefore, you know, kind of an opportunity to support when things are difficult and think about applying psychology to those, which is essentially our role. So then I guess that the challenges in the role are trying to sit with the discomfort of when things are difficult, trying to balance, knowing that the difficult situation hopefully can be improved by your input, but you may not be able to wave a magic wand. It can be challenging when people expect you to have a magic wand and be able to
mm,
wave it and solve the problems. So I think, yeah, because you're working with real people's lives and situations, you know, if you are, you know, if you care about it, which is probably why you want to do that work in the first place, it can be hard to take that on, you know, or work with that, I should say better. All psychologists do get professional supervision. So, you know, every once in a while, you meet with another psychologist and you have a space for your own personal reflection and think about the emotional impact of your work, think about problem solving in your work, thinking about kind of a space for thinking. There's also peer supervision as well, meeting with a group of people to talk things through. So that's an important part of being supported to face those challenges. I would also say the challenge is that there is just a high amount of need. You know,
mm,
schools are doing their best. I can see across the country, schools are doing their best to support young people when they're facing difficulties at school and with their learning. And psychologists are supporting schools to support them, and are also doing their best. But there is likely to be always more need than there is support to support with that. You know, I don't want to get too political, but you know, when we think about the amount of funding that's available as well, you know, historically there's been more, there's been less in like the recent 10 years or so following kind of austerity measures. So yeah, sometimes you do feel like you're working within more limited means, but equally, you know, it's about your perspective and, you know, can you focus on what you can do to support within that situation, and you know what can you do with your time that's going to make the difference. So I think sitting with those situations and thinking about how you can be best supportive is kind of the way forward with that. So I hope that answers your question.
very good. I have two kind of, I bundled them about assistant educational psychologists. I think Claire in the
Mm,
beginning asked, are they advertised by local authorities?
mm.
And Lara asked, what do educational assistant educational psychologists do? I always describe the assistant psychologist role as a kind of like, it's basically the same as you, just like the light version. I don't
It's
know.
like light.
Okay. Yeah. So are they advertised by local authorities? And then, so basically, if I want to become an assistant education psychologist, where do I see these jobs being offered? And then, what do you do as an assistant educational psychologist? What did you do?
Mhm.
Uh,
Well, yeah, from my to the first question about where to find them, The roles I've seen have been advertised. Some have been advertised on LinkedIn. Some have been advertised on individual kind of local authority websites, sometimes on Facebook groups as well. But I would say LinkedIn is a pretty good way of finding them. Yeah. And what you do, well, it kind of varies, really. I mean, you can work for private companies, you can work for the local authority. There are some local authority roles available. I think they are less readily available than like educational psychologist roles themselves. And so it depends on the individual borough or county service, if that's something that they want to support, if that's something they want to invest in. So yeah, there may be some in some areas, but not in others. So there may not be some close to where you want to work. I don't know. I work for a private company. I found out about it through LinkedIn, and my role involved supporting the educational psychologists with kind of getting referral information, so kind of initial kind of information gathering, getting kind of consent forms for our involvement signed, so a bit of admin stuff. It also involved doing some direct work with young people, running interventions that the educational psychologist recommended, looking at their report and thinking about how the recommendations could be implemented. So again, as well as interventions directly that I could do, also thinking about speaking with teachers about how they might be able to implement some of those recommendations, or if they were, appropriate recommendations after all. So speaking with teachers about that, sometimes delivering training, did some training about metacognition for teaching assistants and then for the teachers as well. So yeah, the EdPsych light could be, is not an unfair way of kind of describing it. I know some assistants may also do direct assessment work with young people too, but for certain assessments you have to get additional qualifications, I know.
Could I pick up on this and connect it to one of the questions that Anna asked? She asked, does the profession include providing workshops and training programs for pupils? And I feel like that touches a little bit also on something you hinted at. Like there's this, you can work for a counselor as you do, but you can also work for private companies, which is like a little bit where it's a little bit more kind of, I think the earning potential might at times be higher, but you can, that where schools basically kind of like, oh, we want educational psychologists to come in and provide training or something specific, right? So maybe could you say workshops for children, do you do that? Something about I don't know, resilience or some whatever. You said you do growth mindset intervention training. That might be something, right? But could you kind of, okay. Anna's following up what practical impact metacognition training had. I think, yes, just talk a little bit about workshops, trainings for children. Is that part of it? And maybe a little bit of the role of private companies within the sector. What kind of opportunities they offer.
So yeah, do you mean in terms of being an assistant or
in general? You can also be an EP
Mm.
and work for them, right? You don't have to be for going private, right?
Yeah, you can. I think the majority of EPs work for the public sector, work for local authorities. Some people set up their own businesses. Often that's kind of individual EPs offering their work to be bought by parents to do assessments. And so then if that is the case, then we have to kind of ask ourselves the question about, is it fair that some people have the money to access those and other people don't? So there's definitely kind of ethical implications there. There are also models where private companies sell their services to schools directly, so you can work with schools. That was kind of the model that was adopted for the company I work for. And to be honest, I didn't know much about public sector, private sector. I just wanted to get that experience. But I'm happy working for the public sector now, and I feel like contributing to society by supporting the schools and the communities is something that's important to me. There are lots of jobs out there, and others pay more. This doesn't pay too badly, but if money is your primary goal, then educational psychology will do okay for you. But there are probably other jobs out there that will get you more money if that's what's important to you. So that kind of speaks to that. But in terms as well about running groups with individual children, yeah, you do that as part of your training. That's part of the course requirement. I was speaking to some EPs today who are doing resiliency training with a group of year 10s at a school, and giving them not just kind of skills for learning, but also skills for life, essentially, around a kind of framework of promoting resilience. I think the original brief was, how can we support children's resilience in the classroom? And it sort of evolved from there. So they're doing more direct work. And then the question about what impact did your training have?
Yes, do you think that, I don't know, impact of metacognition training? I don't know if that gets too specific, but maybe you can. I have like 3 more questions, but maybe you can answer. It's like, do you think it had a like a
It's a good
metacognition?
question. No, it's a good question, because I think you're right that to question that, because often, I think about my own experience as a learner, sitting in training sessions, people delivering information to me, and sometimes, it's hard to sit and listen. And I imagine at some points whilst I've been speaking, you've tuned in more and tuned out at other times as well. So I think it's important to be thinking about the impact. How do we know that the work that we do has an impact in general? That's a question that I think we're asking ourselves a lot as a profession, just to make sure for ourselves and for the communities we support that is the case. When we look at research around what works in the classroom, what makes a difference, the Education Endowment Foundations kind of shows that when we support metacognition in the classroom, it can have a big impact. So it's kind of about how you support that, how you develop children to be more independent learners by cultivating their metacognitive skills. So, the intention was to support that because there's a good evidence base around that. But then, of course, it depends on your ability to impart that sense and those strategies to support staff as well. So, we would think about multi-sensory approaches to doing training, ask everyone to get up and walk around and talk with each other, chance for reflection, try out some activities, that kind of thing. Think about how people learn in order to support a training session on that. So yeah, these are some of the practicalities that can be more difficult to do when you are working remotely as well. But yeah, how do we know? Ultimately, I suppose we can't know that it's, well, I would say about that. How do we know if it's had an impact?
I think,
guess
I don't know. Yeah, I think this might get us a little bit more into like almost like the problems of the field to evaluate our interventions. So maybe kind of I think if you don't mind, I stop you there and kind of
Sure.
shift a little bit the conversation, which is a really interesting topic. I think I have 2 bigger questions. I have one question which I promised to ask explicitly, is that can you be a educational psychologist and a teacher at the same time? It sounds that was one question I would ask, and then I have kind of 2 bigger questions I think I would love to ask before then. So can you be an educational psychologist and a teacher at the same time?
Theoretically, yes, you can. If you're trained to be a teacher, if you've done the EdPsych doctorate training, you can be. I would say not many people are. But what does happen quite often is that people will do a few days of work as an educational psychologist and then a few days of work doing other things. Because of the way our work is allocated, it's sort of on a across the year, how many days you work basis. You can kind of work full time, or you can work 3 days a week. You can work, someone I know works the equivalent of 3.25 days per week. So across a year, it works out as kind of 130 out of 200 allocated school days. But essentially, I'm saying that there's a lot of flexibility. If you wanted to do this role for a few days and then do something else for a few days, that's okay. You could do that. And that's not true of all jobs. So that's one real benefit. I'm starting to do some work with a head teacher at a school, someone who doesn't work in Islington, someone separate, who I've had a kind of previous working relationship with, and they're a head teacher and they wanted some psychological supervision. So I'm I'm doing that work privately, just working with them to be their professional supervisor. And, I get a lot of enjoyment and satisfaction from that, knowing that I'm supporting someone who's supporting a whole school system. I don't think I would personally want to do private work, doing lots of assessment private work, but something like that, I really will enjoy. So that may mean in the future, if I do more of that I bring down my hours as a full-time EP and do more of that work. But I haven't told my employers that I'm thinking that, so maybe keep that a secret.
Okay, I won't tell on you. I think I have like two bigger questions. Like one, I think is like several that Lara asked, is kind of like, what are the skills basically that you need, the knowledge that you need to become an EP? Because there's, on the one hand, right, you can say like, oh, 1 to 2 years seems to be a minimum of work experience with your degree within the sector. But then I think a related question to that is like, oh, like, should I do, is it like, if I think you described the case of a person who basically finished, then was 2 years a TA, a teaching assistant, and then applied and it worked, which seems like she didn't have a lot of variety within her work experience. Is that okay? Is that not okay? So it's a little bit like, how do I think Lara was asking, how do I know when I have enough knowledge? So that's a little bit like kind of like basically thereafter, if I do work experience, what do I look for? How do I know I have a lot? I mean, my pragmatic suggestion would be like, if you have 1 or 2 years, just start applying. So
Yeah, why not?
but yeah, maybe you can like speak to that.
Sure. Yeah. So wait, what was the question again? Sorry.
So like basically, how do I like
skills?
what
The
are the
skills.
specific skills I
Yeah.
need, right?
I had a mind blank. Sorry.
And then like we are basically best ways to get them. I think, Lara, let me know in the chat if that doesn't quite capture. I think you have 3 questions centered around that.
Yeah, sorry. I remembered the question as soon as I asked what it was.
Perfectly fine.
Yeah. So it's a good point, and I think often in the talks I've done, in the talk I've done today and talks I've done before, I talk about reflecting on your experiences, thinking about how you apply psychology. But fundamentally, when you're a psychologist, the reality is that you meet with people you haven't met before who might be stressed and want your help. So a really key skill that you need is to be able to build rapport with people quite quickly. So the role is focused around supporting positive change for people and feeling like change is possible. And if you don't like someone, then you don't listen to what they have to say, and you don't want to either follow the advice that they give or think deeply about the questions that they're asking. So a real skill is to be able to make people feel comfortable and have kind of good interpersonal skills, really, and communication skills. So I think those are quite key, and those are things that you can get from jobs and experiences, but also just from life as well. I think you need to be able to show those in your life and in your experiences when you're applying. But yeah, so I'd say that's a really important skill. And also you will be asked to write reports as well about what you find, about what you discuss. So being able to kind of write succinctly, having writing skills. Sometimes the interviews have a writing test, or it's more of like a check rather than a test, just to make sure that you're able to kind of write in paragraphs and can write succinctly, write that kind of thing, because it's an important part of the role to be able to capture the work that is completed and be able to share that with others and to the local authority. So that's one other skill as well. But I think fundamentally is that around interpersonal skills, about being able to build rapport with people quickly, to make them feel comfortable, contained, and to be able to work with you to move forward from what can be a tricky situation.
All right, great. I think you hinted a little bit that what happens in the interviews. I think I wouldn't like to open this topic tonight. I think it's like I think my really strong recommendation, I mean, if you're applying and you get invited to interviews, seek out Lauren's advice, seek out the advice from others. I think there are YouTube videos on what happens in the interviews to be prepared. But I think at that point, it's really good to kind of form connections with EPs in either on Facebook groups with people you meet during talks like that, or where you work, right? When you shadow somebody, to kind of say like, hey, what happened in your interview? I know they're a little bit different than what, for instance, the career service often provides you with, because it's a little bit more, it's less like an assessment center. Where do you see yourself in 5 years, etc. And it's more that you can demonstrate in the interview your skills. I wanted to kind of end with one answer, one question where I suspect your answer will be a little bit longer, but I think I feel the same about educational psychology as I feel about clinical psychology, that it's not just, you can have a passion for helping children in the educational sector without becoming an EP, right? I think you could
Definitely
try to get, so if I, for instance, I mean, selfishly, right, if I kind of talk to my personal tutees, it's like, well, you could start, become a teaching assistant and see if you like it. You can, I think sometimes there's the role of educational well-being practitioner, which is also a little bit like, I think something like a lighter version of what you're doing with less intense cases. I mean, this is like a little controversial, but you could do ABA therapy with children, and there are many other jobs. I think I have a friend of mine. She never studied psychology, but she basically does assessments with children around learning disabilities, and then works individually with these. Like more like a speech therapist. I think she gets mad if I call her a speech therapist. I'm not quite sure, but there are many interesting roles. She can diagnose learning disabilities. There are many different things, right, that you can do in the, like, ideally in the time between graduating and your doctorate. But even if you're not ending up a educational psychologist, I think there are really a lot of fulfilling roles that you can do if you care about children.
Definitely.
Like, right, I don't know, like that, this kind of underbelly is such a, like, I don't know, judgmental term, but like, could you kind of give us a little, because I think you mentioned something as well, something like a training about, I don't know, what was it, like when you talk about the people you're working with, it was something like, I can't quite remember. It was like assistant well-being, I don't know, something. Yeah, maybe just like, I don't know. And I think if that's okay with everyone, I would make that the last question. But just kind of like, if I graduate, I try to get a system psychology role. I try to be a TA, which I don't think is hard to get. But then also, what are other jobs there that I could do in the meantime to build up these skills? Yes, I think it would be really good to know.
Yeah, I think teaching assistant is definitely a good one, and that would give you experience of working in a school and just what it's like to be in a school and the challenges that come with that, kind of knowledge and experience of supporting young people, you know, directly. Often teaching assistants will work with young people with some additional learning needs, so you get to know young people quite closely. So that can be kind of a good place to go if you feel like working in a school will be interesting for you. Then in a kind of related role, as you say, there are more specialists kind of teaching support roles. One of them that we're developing at the moment is called emotional literacy support assistant. As you say, there are kind of school wellbeing practitioners who are like specialists, not quite teaching assistants because they work for the NHS, but they go to different schools and they run interventions, group and individual preventative interventions around mental health and wellbeing. So that can also be a good way to get an insight about work directly with young people and supporting mental health. As you say, a lot of psychology students go on to kind of build on the knowledge of cognition and language, and then go on to become speech and language therapists. Sometimes occupational therapists also work kind of directly in schools, also in other community settings, but that can be, I know some psychology students have gone on to do that as well. and teachers as well, of course. But I would say the teaching assistant role is a good way, without needing any additional qualifications, to get an insight about what it's like working in a school. And no doubt you could speak to the Senko at the school or someone at the school and ask to have a conversation with the educational psychologist. In fact, the teacher at one of the schools spoke to me recently because they were applying for the course, so wanted to get a bit of insight into that. So
Yes, that's very
yeah.
helpful. I think somebody asked educational well-being practitioner. I think if you want to learn a little bit more about us, one of our alumni is doing it, and she was last year. She talked about it. It's on our, like, recorded on our events page. If you read through the description, in one of their alumni events I organized basically a year ago, one person talks about being an educational well-being practitioner, which is like I don't know, is it at UCL as well? Do you know that by chance? It's like basically you do it for a year. It's paid by the NHS, and it's a little bit like I think you work 3 days or 4 days, and then you go to university, and you get training there for a day or two.
Nice.
So yes, I think educational mental health practitioner, that could be, I don't know. I think it might be it. It's a certificate. It's a when you get paid to do it. This might be the better term. I'm not sure. I think she called herself a educational well-being practitioner. Lawrence, I think I should be conscious of the time. Thank you so much. That was very, very good. Really enjoyed it. I think if anyone has, I think Anna, I see another question coming in the chat. I would just stop the recording here. Thank you so much. It was really, really good. And yeah, if like, no worries, Anna, no worries. Yes, I think I would just like end it here. Thank you so much, Lawrence. Really enjoyed it, learned again more. And yeah, I like your profession. I think it's definitely something I feel like, oh, I wish I could do that. And I don't feel very often about this. All right, I stop it here. And yes.